Hello, I'm Randall Pinkston, and welcome to Ethics Matter, a program of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Our guest today is Professor J.P. Singh, the chair of the Culture and Political Economy and director of the Institute for International Cultural Relations at the University of Edinburgh. Did I get all of that?
You did. Thank you for having me here.
You've published dozens of scholarly articles, edited 3 books, and you've written several books yourself. The most recent is Sweet Talk, Paternalism and Collective Action in North and South Trade Negotiations. Welcome to Ethics Matter, Professor Singh.
Thank you.
Before we talk about the details of the Institute at Edinburgh and your book, I'd like for you to take a few minutes to get our audience oriented to what you mean when you talk about cultural studies. It is a relatively new discipline in academia, is it not?
Right. Well, for a long time we ignored cultural issues, except for a few academics who focused on anthropologists, for example. And what the anthropologists were trying to investigate were ways of life. That's what an anthropological understanding of culture is. But political scientists, economists, many other social scientists didn't go near that. Perhaps because of the reason that's often brought up is because of what happened during the Nazi era, that culture got mixed with a particular type of a political economy. And so culture was sort of laid aside. And since the 1980s, perhaps as a result of social movements which began to focus on cultural identity issues and the impetus that was building up towards culture, that culture has made its way back into the social sciences. So people like me who work on the intersection of culture and other social sciences, in my case culture and political economy, what we're looking at is those ways of life and the symbolic representations of those ways of life, and as they then bleed over into our politics and our economics. So I focus a lot on cultural relations, and what I'm interested in is the ways that communities interact with each other given their understandings of themselves as to who they are. And because that's what culture is, who am I? And then depending on who I am and what the power equations might be in terms of telling me who I am, I would have my set of symbolic representations, which could include museum displays, films, especially popular culture.
So last year in America, there were some cultural clashes surrounding the political campaign for president. How would your studies analyze what happened in America compared to what happened with Brexit in the United Kingdom? What's the interplay there?
I think where I would connect it back to the conversation we've been having is that anytime any person's cultural ritual or symbol gets threatened, that's going to produce anxiety. No, because we don't like our neighborhoods to change. Now, I think of my mother, for example, as a really open, courageous person. But every now and then say, you know, I'm 84 years old and I'm not going to change. But I think we all say that. I'm 300 years old and this is how it is and I'm not going to change. And at the flip side of that is an enormous amount of cultural anxiety we feel when things begin to change around us. We get these cultural politics in UK and US when it's not the same as the 1930s Germany, for example, where there was an enormous amount of cultural anxiety, but we could relate it back to Germany having had a very hard economic time. By all indicators, US economy is flourishing and was flourishing, if not flourishing, highly stabilized in 2016 than it had been in, say, 2008 or 2009. So we get a whole lot of people with a whole lot of cultural anxiety, which we can tie to economics in that there were a lot of political leaders saying, oh, we're just not doing well. But I think at some basic level, people knew that unemployment rates were way below where they were earlier. So the question is, where did it come from?
Yes, what's the source of that? What is your assessment?
I think we live in a world where we are open to the world. You open up your Facebook page and you're confronted with different points of view and different pictures that you may not have experienced before. I think this is not the 1950s where you open up the New York Times and all of a sudden you see one picture from the Sudan about the famine. now all of a sudden you're seeing pictures of migrants, of refugees, of governments around the world.
And of attacks where people are killed in
Right.
theaters and restaurants.
Exactly. And so you live in this maelstrom of cultural images. And the equivalent of my mother's, I'm 84 years old and I'm not going to change, is to then find like-minded people. And fortunately or unfortunately, that's also easy to do with technology. It's what we researchers would call homophily effects and stovepiping effect. I can go out and find 1 million people just like me who say, let's build a wall then. No, let's keep these images out. Let's keep these sets of peoples out there, because then we can return to that same mythological, originary way of life.
I don't want to get too political with our conversation, but is there any connection at all to the phrase that became part of the candidate who won, "Make America Great Again"? What did that really mean in terms of how his supporters identified themselves culturally, and the kind of anxieties that they were expressing?
I would say that culture is about myth making. No, and we need myths. We need the myths of the hero. We need our religious myths. We need our fictional myths. We need all sorts of myths. And American myth has been that of greatness. And that it's a heroic myth of a conquering hero who goes out. And it's not very different from the Greek myths or the myths in India, Mahabharata, etc. In order to convince people that you needed this person, you had to first convince people that they weren't great.
That's
Right.
which is sort of counterintuitive based on what you were just saying.
Exactly.
About the economy,
Right.
about, well, forget the stock market. I mean, my goodness, I mean, it's going up still, but it was going up before
Right.
The election.
And that's probably the story that historians will be analyzing forever. As I said earlier, this is not the 1930s. It's not easy to turn around and say, look at the humiliation that Germany had suffered. No, after
America
World War I.
has not suffered.
So we had not had the, but the discourse at times was similar. We, nobody said we're humiliated, but said, look what's become of us. We used to be great, and here's we are now.
But what were the indicators that people were using to make that assertion?
Exactly the ones that we were talking about. When you look at what were they talking about, they were talking about our borders have been opened and people have come in and threatened our way of life. So the two that came up over and over again was, one, our neighbor to the south of us, Mexico, and the things that were said about Mexico, and the other one was our neighbor in religion, from the very same place that Christianity arose, Islam. So, and if one goes back and starts to look at not just the fact that we are all human, but just the geographical contiguity of people next to each other, knowing each other, then Christianity and Islam, born of the same place, and Mexico and the United States, born of the same land, You would think that there wouldn't be any cultural differences, but I think that's where our technologies have played a role, our media have played a role, various kinds of media, and our anxieties. I think as researchers, what cultural relations and cultural studies is coming forth is to speak of these globalization anxieties that people are feeling. Now, I would say, since you mentioned cultural studies, that a lot of people from cultural studies have said this didn't have anything to do with culture, this had to do with class. And that's going to be an unending debate too, that the shift of the white worker from voting for a very different president 8 years ago and 4 years ago to now voting for Trump signaled that that was the class of people that wasn't doing well. But I just, for me, as a researcher, that leaves too many unanswered questions as to why still the defection was race-based. Why not the other workers?
In announcing the formation of, the continuation of your Institute for Cultural Relations, you wrote that it's time to defend the liberal world order from the threat of fragmentation. And you track the development of this world order from World War II. So give me some examples of what we now refer to as the liberal world order, and then tell me how you see it coming apart.
That's the liberal world order with the big L of enlightenment, very Western concept, but the idea being that if we talk to each other, we'll learn about each other's ways of life and we'll get along. It's a very idealistic point of view that if I have neighbors who are different from me, and if I baked cookies and we started to talk on a lawn, that there would be no borders, there would be understanding. It's the kind of liberal world order that people from the Scottish Enlightenment believed in. David Hume, Adam Smith, when Adam Smith was talking about his pin factory and saying, if you have one person making pins, you're going to get a few pins at the end of the day. But if you have 8 people who specialize, they would make boxes and boxes of pins because they can specialize in different tasks. But and he's talked about how it's not to the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer, but through their regard to their self-interest that we get our meat and wine. As liberal thinkers, what they were thinking was that it's not that when we talk with each other, we lay aside our personal selves, but that there is a greater good that comes out of this. And that greater good could be what Rousseau would have called the general will, the idea of a society which then has a polity and believes in that. No, the birth of democracy is in that form of liberalism. I mean, this is what, whether you were a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian, whether you were pro-Europe or anti-Europe, at the heart of it was, how do we get a political order based on us interacting with each other? So what I mean by defending the liberal world order is a liberal world order where we are talking with each other, because a world which is separated by walls and borders, where we are not allowed to talk to each other, or that we have self-selected into groups where we're just not going to have a conversation, goes against what Tocqueville was noticing about America, that neighbors talk to neighbors here. That's what he noticed coming from France, which is a hierarchical society.
And that kind of separation automatically leads to conflict, doesn't it?
Yes. That's the liberal belief, that it would. Now, there are other points of view. Somebody from the left would say, you can talk as much as you want, but unless your material wants are satisfied, if you're poor, it's not going to happen. And then a liberal answer to that would be, yes, the very rich and the very poor are not going to talk about democracy much. But that's where we're having those discussions. Ostensibly in the United States, we do have that healthy middle. Now, the median voter for Trump was close to $70,000. That's a healthy middle. Mm-hmm. Then you wonder, why do we get these divisive politics when we have a healthy middle? So something else is going on about these liberal processes, and there's a sort of a liberal order at stake here, which is what I was referring to in the article from that Scottish newspaper that you referred to.
So then how do you begin to set up a way of measuring the causes behind the fragmentation? What kind of metrics do you use? What kind of questions do you ask?
Good question. So off the top of my head, a couple of things that we've been doing already. One is to actually go back and speak to how we had processes which produced the kind of democracy that was healthy and produced prosperity for people. So whether it's surveys speaking to types of democracy, types of prosperity, and the effects that they have on people, I think we need those because it may be that we've forgotten some of those earlier surveys. I'll give you an example of something that we did from our institute. It's the British Council, which wanted to see the effects of soft power, because we speak a lot to how countries can be very attractive, but oftentimes we mix in the causes and the effects. So we've done a study, mostly statistical, looking at what might get constituted as soft power resources, the health of a democracy, the prosperity of a country, its cultural institutions, to then try to measure what effect they might have. And the kinds of things we looked at was the number of international students coming in, number of tourists coming in, foreign direct investment in the country, or its political influence. And what we found from the study, which would be a very useful antidotal moment to, say, Brexit or the kinds of divisive cultural politics, is that countries which have healthy pluralism, countries which are relatively prosperous and have open, transparent cultural institutions are much more likely to attract foreign direct investment, have global political influence, have international students come to that country and tourists come to that country than otherwise. Anecdotally, I would say that there's now evidence coming out that the number of tourists to the United States have declined in the last couple of months, and that we are finding stories of people who don't want to travel I think the other thing that institutes of international cultural relations can do, and which is where I think a large part of my institute's agenda is going to be, is to do an exhumation of when we had these liberal values, why didn't they work out? If they were so great, then why do we find ourselves in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century when we thought we had gotten past? Why are we back to that moment where the politics culturally has become so divisive? So what happened? And one of the ways I think we can do that is by perhaps questioning where the earlier values came from. You know, were they values born of everyday interactions? I think that's what Tocqueville was referring to when he says neighbors talk to neighbors. Or were they values which were dictated on from high and perhaps didn't trickle down as well as we thought they had? So that's, I think.
And that, of course, means that you need a leader who will believe in those values and transmit them to, in the case of a politician, to the voters.
You can, and I think that's...
If it's from on high, that is to say.
I think that's how we did it in the past.
Yeah.
That we had leaders who propagated a certain set of values. Fortunately for us, they tended to be these sort of universal values of brotherhood and universal values of sisterhood, universal values of humanity.
Yeah.
So we came up with a universal declaration of human rights. In the UNESCO, they had a World Heritage Program. It wasn't going to be somebody's symbol, it was going to be the world symbol. So Taj Mahal was no longer just a place in India, it was for the whole, it was humanity's heritage. So we espoused a set of universal values. United States, by the way, even in terms of UNESCO, stood aside, and because we've had this sense of, well, wouldn't it become the UN symbol? This is an American symbol, and so we hesitated to join bodies like UNESCO for that very reason, that somehow we would be giving away our heritage. But
even though the liberal order is in part what brought the United Nations into being, well, the League of Nations and then the United Nations into being, correct?
Exactly.
Supported by American leaders of that era.
Exactly. We wouldn't have had a United Nations were it not for the United States. And the conferences started in Dumbarton Oaks, next door to now what is the White House in some ways, and it ended in San Francisco. UNESCO's preamble begins with, it's in the, since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Those lines came from the US poet laureate, Archibald MacLeish. And Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, borrowed Archibald MacLeish's words. So even UNESCO's preamble, the most famous words that anybody in UNESCO can recite, came from the United States, from a poet right here.
Let's turn for a minute, if you don't mind, to your book, Sweet Talk, Paternalism and Collective Action in North and South Trade Relations. Now, that work is focused on trade relations between what we generally refer to as the industrialized nations of the world, although industrialized is sort of a passé term now, isn't it? We're beyond the industrial era, aren't we? Into the so-called developing nations where the natural resources are gathered and harvested and sent to the north for development. What prompted your interest in that relationship, and how does cultural relations inform what you think should happen between those two?
So as a researcher, I was trained to look at particular things and our political events, and then ask myself the question, what is this an example of? Right? And try to infer something from there. I'd always felt that there's a dark side to international interactions, that behind that liberal world order was a sense in the industrialized West to maintain its position of superiority. I just couldn't believe the fact that in 1947 or 48, when the United Nations and other organizations, in this particular case, what became the General Agreements for Tariffs and Trade, the International Trade Organization, was coming into being, that all of a sudden the so-called colonial powers had said, oh, okay, we're done with this colonial oppression and now we believe in the global liberal order where we're all going to be better off. So I wanted to look at that history, because what was getting suggested to me from the developing world, having grown up there, was that they had been manipulated over and over again into signing international trade agreements which were not in their favor. This book is actually a very pro-trade book. So what I trace in this book, using all kinds of methods, is a history which shows that the developing world wanted to be the part of the same international trading order that the North wanted, but what they got instead was a position on the side. We'll give you this much, but don't ask for that big plate in the middle. No, so what they got, for example, was preferences for certain goods which would have no customs duties, rather than getting tariff reductions, which is how the US and European Union would negotiate. So it's almost as if the industrialized West was saying, we'll reduce tariffs vis-a-vis each other, but these other countries will give them handouts. And so what you have is—
But no tariff reduction.
No tariff reduction.
So if you were making goods in, say, a country X in the South, and you wanted to export the good into the US, your good was charged a tariff?
It was, unless you were exporting raw materials. So raw materials would have very low tariffs, but if you exported just copper, you would have lower tariffs, but if you made it into a copper wire, then you'd have high tariffs. And that's what kept the developing world in a position of being a primary producer. So leaders from the developing world in the 1950s were saying, we want some protections for our industry to grow so we can export to you copper wires, because we know we'll always be in a position of poverty if we only exported copper. What I do in the book is to show a cultural story, how there was a kind of a collective mindset which acted against that. So while we were talking about these liberal values, these universal values, the dark side that I'm interested in uncovering is how colonialism continued in a different sort of a guise, and that was by keeping people in a state of poverty, by always giving carve-outs rather than allowing them to play in the same field as everybody else was. And then I do a quantitative study too. So I do studies from a very granular level, dealing with particular kinds of cases such as cotton or sugar or textiles, to services trade, high-tech services trade, to show over and over again how the developing world is not allowed tariff reductions. The preference from the West has been to give them carve-outs on the side. I tell the story in Sweet Talk of when we had the Caribbean Basin Initiative during the Reagan times, and the idea was to keep out communism from the Caribbean. No. And at that time, the sugar lobby said, we have to put tariffs against sugar coming from the Caribbean, which threw out 30,000 farmers sugar farmers out of jobs in the Dominican Republic. So if we were trying to thwart communism, then throwing 30,000 farmers out of their jobs
is counterintuitive.
But those are the lengths to which we would go, because we have lobbies which have historically operated in a particular way. And what the story I tell in Sweet Talk is as a part of understanding the cultural glue which holds these interest groups together is precisely what culture tells us, those representations, those rituals which make things grow and continue to be a certain way, regardless of what the outcomes are going to be for, in this case, the global humanity.
I do want to leave on a positive note, if I possibly can.
Right.
Do you have any, in your research, any examples of how cultural relations and studies are producing positive results with respect to, I don't know, the decisions that our politicians make or elected officials? I mean, has there been any glimmer of hope in recent years? Because what you're describing is a moving away from a we-ness.
Yes.
And it's all about exclusion. Right. It's keeping people out, keeping goods out, limiting trade.
Right. Well, I think that what we've also seen in our cultural politics in the last 6 years is for every one person who says build borders, there's another person saying don't. No. The Oscars in 2017, the entire show was about not building borders. No. And that's a powerful, if we want to call it that, lobby. Because who takes care of a country's stories? It's people who are artists, and they're basically saying, we're not going to tell a story which is divisive. We're not going to show up, despite somebody saying, they were all there, I saw them, there were 1 million people there, they were all there singing my song. But is somebody going to sing that song of divisiveness? And so my hopefulness would be that where are you going to find that poet who's going to sing your song about dividing the world? Now, who's going to paint that on a wall for you? Even if you built that wall, who will paint something which reminds the world of who we are? Because at the end of the day, you need the poet. And I'm sorry, but the divisiveness of this cultural politics is that there are no poets. And once a nation loses its song, once a nation loses its poetry, you're not going to get there. So my hope is that there's a whole lot of people out there, millions out there, who are going to mobilize against this. However, I say it plaintively because before we get there, do we have to suffer the kind of mayhem we did in the past? Or can we get there in a better way? So I hope that what we can be able to do through places like my institute is to have the kind of conversations which allow us to foster the kind of poetry we'd like to see on, where we memorialize cultures.
Professor Singh, we wish you great success with the Institute, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pinkston. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.